Hi everyone and welcome back to Open Source Tonight. Let's talk about a couple different desktops and see which one I prefer. I will just tell you up front, I prefer the Gnome desktop, the Gnome 3 desktop. Some people also pronounce it Gnome. I prefer to pronounce it Gnome, but that's my personal taste. Anyway, there is also a desktop that was based on Gnome 2, which is the older version of Gnome, that's called Mate. It is named after a Spanish drink. Anyway, but the Mate desktop is very similar to the Gnome 2 desktop, makes sense it's based on it, and then Gnome 3 is, again, well, I mean, it's Gnome 3. Now, I have to say, I do like the Mate desktop, but the reason I personally like Gnome 3 better is because I can do things that really help my workflows. For example, you can hit the super key, or what people would call the Windows key on most keyboards, hit that, and then you can get a search box immediately. And so I could hit it, and then I could be like, oh, I'm looking for this program. Hit it, type, let's say, DaVinci Resolve, hit enter, and boom, DaVinci Resolve is officially launching on my screen. I never had to touch the mouse. I never had to search through any menus. It's just so quick, and you can't really easily do that in Mate, okay? Another thing that you can do in the Gnome desktop that's really nice, at least if you ask me, is the fact that with the Gnome 3 desktop, you do have the ability, if you hit just the super key by itself without trying to search for anything and not type anything, you do get to see a screen of all your open applications very easily. And so that's something that's really nice. It makes it easy to do that. Now, both Mate and the Gnome 3 desktop does actually have what's called virtual desktops, where you can switch between different desktops. I think that Gnome 3 actually calls them workspaces or something instead, but regardless, that's the idea. You can put different windows in them and stuff and move between them. So that's something really interesting. I will say, though, there is some pros for Mate, so I will give that fair disclosure. The Mate desktop, for example, one thing that's really good about the Mate desktop is the fact that it's a lot lighter weight in my experience on RAM usage out of the box. So that's something to keep in mind if you're on a low, system utilization system where you don't have a lot of power, or you want to save that for something else on the computer rather than the desktop. Then, the Gnome desktop does use a little more resources than the Mate desktop in my experience. And so that's something to keep in mind. Another thing about the Mate desktop, too, is if you prefer the Gnome 2 workflow and you're used to it, or you have people that you support that's used to it, right, that kind of thing, then it does, feel very much at home. And so you could very easily transition someone from, like, Gnome 2, actual Gnome 2, to Mate if you needed to. And at this point, really, Gnome 2 is pretty much not supported on anything as far as I'm aware. So, you would realistically be on Mate anyway, right? But the point of the matter is somebody that was used to, like, Gnome 2 and said, I want to go back to something like that. Well, you can. You can go back to the Mate desktop and you can have a great experience. So I think that's an interesting thing to consider. Another thing to consider is the fact that the Gnome desktop on the Gnome side is really one of the most popular desktops on Linux in general. So it seems to get a lot of development and support. And, whether or not you like the way that the Gnome desktop is going, that's something that can be debated, and everybody's going to have different views on that probably. But one thing you can definitely say for sure is that it's being maintained. It's got a lot of support behind it. A lot of distributions ship it. You can, get it on anything, and a lot of distributions ship it as their default desktop. Red Enterprise Linux does. Rocky Linux does. Fedora does, from what I'm aware. Debian, I think the default is Gnome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you, look at Gnome 3, it seems to be very widely available and supported. And sure, you could get it on basically anything, and not saying you can't with Mate, but, in my experience with distributions, a lot of times that desktop they support, is the main desktop, is the one that gets the best reliability on that system. That's been my experience. So, like, for example, in theory, could you install Gnome 3 on a Linux Mint system? In theory, you could, right? But would it work as good? I don't know. Maybe it is based on Ubuntu, and I found that Gnome 3 on Ubuntu does work pretty good, so maybe. But I haven't tested it, and your, mileage may vary. And so, like, for example, with the Cinnamon desktop, I played with it before on things that it was not Linux Mint, and I found it sometimes can have issues in the past. Maybe those have been fixed over the years. I don't know. But using a Linux Mint itself seems to just be more stable, which makes sense because that's, again, like the main desktop for Linux Mint. They're going to make sure everything works and just syncs up really well. So there's just a couple thoughts I have between, like, Mate and Gnome 3. Let me know in the comments which one out of these you prefer, or if you prefer a completely different one, tell me that, and let me know why that you prefer the desktop that you do. Thank you so much for watching Open Source Tonight. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see y'all again very soon. Goodbye, everybody.
And action.